In this video, we're going to look at the issues and challenges relating to the regulation and control of the media. Now, this is a key knowledge dot point from the VCE Media Study Design, so it's really important that you understand what some of these challenges are, as well as having some case studies and examples that demonstrate them. And now, while there are a range of different challenges facing media regulators in the contemporary media landscape, we're going to focus on two of these only. The first challenge is in upholding community standards through the classification board. In another video in this series, we've talked about how upholding community standards is one of the reasons to regulate the media, and in the modern media landscape, it is becoming more and more difficult. The Classification Board is a media regulator that has been in Australia for decades. It is a government regulatory body, and they decide what rating or what classification to give every film, DVD, and computer game before it is released in Australia. They also classify some literature, so books and magazines, but what they don't do is regulate TV. That's a really common mistake that students end up writing, and it's just flat wrong, so avoid doing it. They classify films, DVDs, and video games so that adults can make informed choices about what media content they choose to watch or engage with, as well as deciding what their children should watch. Some classifications are merely advisory, whereas others restrict the access to people over a certain age. And these age restrictions are enforceable by law. And although it is an independent regulatory body, the Classification Board is still overseen by the government and therefore answers ultimately to ACMA as well as the Federal Attorney General. When discussing classification, it's important to remove the word censorship from your vocabulary. Classification is not the same as censorship. There are many countries, including our close neighbour New Zealand, who do censor their media. And what censorship means is it actually involves removing specific shots or scenes or images or language or blurring certain imagery that the censors decide is inappropriate. Australia doesn't do this. Instead, we merely classify all material, and anything that has content that is grossly inappropriate and offensive is simply refused classification and won't be sold or distributed in Australia. Now, the Classification Board is made up of approximately 20 people who are all supposed to represent the whole of Australia. However, when we actually scroll through the members of the Classification Board, we can actually see that they don't exactly represent the diverse nature of the Australian community. In fact, most of the Classification Board members are white, middle-class Sydney-siders, and yet they're supposed to represent the whole of the country. The way that they go about classifying material is in teams, usually of 3, members of the board will watch or play or read each submission and decide on the classification by majority vote. They do this before the film, DVD, or game is released to the general public. And when they're classifying material, they look at 6 classifiable elements in each film or video game. When you think about the labels that appear on the DVDs, some of these elements might ring a bell. They include coarse language, violence, drug use, adult themes, nudity, and sex. And by analysing whether a film or video game includes any of these elements and to what extent they include it, the board members will come to a decision as to what classification to allocate. And as far as reflecting community standards, the system works. We can look at the example of E.T. the Extraterrestrial, which was originally released in 1982 and was classified G for general audiences. However, any film that is re-released and undergoes any changes needs to be resubmitted to the classification board. This happened with E.T. in 2002 for the 20th anniversary DVD. This DVD was resubmitted to the classification board, and they actually decided to increase the classification to PG. This is because there was medium-level coarse language and supernatural themes. Why did the rating go up? Well, it's because this change actually reflected the shift in Australian society's values. In the 1980s, families were a little bit more relaxed in terms of what they allowed their children to watch. Whereas in 2002, the board decided that it should be fair that parents should be given a little bit of warning about the coarse language and spooky themes. The irony, of course, is that the resubmitted film was actually edited in order to be more child-friendly. I wonder if you can look at the two versions and spot the difference. That's right, in the 2002 version, all guns were actually edited out using CGI techniques and replaced by walkie-talkies, again to reflect an evolution in society's values where promoting guns to children was not seen as acceptable. So when classifying films, DVDs, and video games, the classification board decides on what classification to apply. They do this by looking at the assessed impact or the severity of the classifiable elements mentioned earlier, and they weigh each of these elements against an impact. From there, you'll be very familiar with the classification categories that apply in Australia. For content that has a very mild impact, a G rating applies for general audiences. For mild impact, PG for parental guidance. If there's moderate impact, it will receive an M rating that's recommended for mature audiences. If a film or video game has a strong impact, it's MA, restricted to people over the age of 15. High impact receives an R rating, restricting it to people over the age of 18. And if there's high impact of sexually explicit material, then it gets the X rating. The categories on the left are advisory categories. Anybody can technically watch or hire or purchase any film that is within these advisory categories. So technically a 3-year-old could buy movie tickets to see an M-rated film. However, the categories on the right are restricted. Only audience members over the ages that are prescribed here can actually consume this content. And if anyone under those ages are caught consuming it, then they and the service provider may well be fined or arrested by police. There is, however, a 7th category that you may not know of. This is the refused classification category, where a film or video game cannot be sold, hired, or advertised in Australia due to extremely high impact of the classifiable elements. This is pretty rare in Australia. However, there have been some films and games that are refused classification or otherwise known as being banned. Ken Park is one such film. Released in 2002, Ken Park was refused classification by the Classification Board of Australia. This was due to extremely explicit and violent sex scenes, and this outraged some film buffs in Australia who believe that as adults, they should be able to decide what they watch.
I'm here to see a film that I think everyone should have a choice to be able to see. I don't like the idea that someone is going to make up my mind for me.
You know, I'm an adult. We should be able to see any film that there is that's around there that, you know, this film has been shown in many other countries, so why can't we see it in Australia? What's wrong with us?
This actually resulted in a secret screening of the film. This was organised by prominent Australian film critic Margaret Pomerantz. And the screening actually took place one night in Sydney where police actually showed up and asked that the film not be played.
Why do you have to comply, Margaret?
Well, it was agreed.
What did he say to you?
I personally would keep it going.
Did he say he was serving you with a summons?
Back in Balmain, Margaret's Bolshe blood got the better of her.
What have you just done?
Oh, well, I stopped it and then I put it on again.
When Pomerantz refused and started playing the film for the audience, the police actually turned off the power, seized the film, and arrested Pomerantz. So we can see the effectiveness of government regulation through the Classification Board, where in 2002, Ken Park was refused classification due to the high impact of sex scenes. Many of these were violent, non-consensual, underage, and glorified. However, a group did decide to screen the film despite the ban, and the police showed up, turned off the power, and arrested the organisers. To this day, Ken Park is still refused classification and therefore banned in Australia. You will not find a DVD or a film reel on our shores. You cannot buy or rent this film anywhere. However, it is freely available on YouTube to watch in Australia. Now granted, this screenshot was taken in August 2019, and since then YouTube have cleaned things up and the full-length movies are no longer available. However, it doesn't take too much Googling to find and download a full-length version of this movie, although I wouldn't recommend it. So what does this tell us? Well, this case study highlights a key challenge in regulating content in the contemporary media landscape. In the past, tangible media, so media that was actually a physical copy like a film reel or a DVD, was really easy for authorities to stop from arriving on Australian shores. It's easy for police to attend a promoted screening and turn off the power and seize any of the offensive material. However, nowadays media content is intangible and it's globally available. We download things in the privacy of our own home, often using VPNs and other means of navigating around Australian restrictions. So for authorities, limiting the distribution of material that has been refused classification is virtually impossible nowadays. Or, as the study design puts it, as the media increasingly crosses national borders, governments struggle to maintain control over laws and policies created for their jurisdictions. Or to put it another way, online media can be everywhere, whereas laws only apply to each individual country. So to weigh up the effectiveness of the Classification Board, well, some of its strengths are that it does have authority through the law. It can fine or arrest those who break it. Every film and game is checked before it is released to the public, which gives adult audiences informed choices about what they watch. And another strength of the board is that it is made up of regular Australian citizens. The idea is that they will reflect our values because they live them. However, as we have seen, there are some significant weaknesses with the Classification Board. It is really difficult to police online. It's a system of regulation that was much better suited to the broadcast era and has lost its relevance and has lost its bite when media is consumed online in the privacy of our own homes. Also, it's really slow to act. By having to classify material before it is released to the Australian public, that results in Aussies having to wait for content longer than those in other nations. And when video can be streamed immediately from anywhere around the globe, having to wait is no longer an option. Finally, the refused classification category might be seen to limit the freedom of citizens. Who are these three Sydney-siders to decide what I can and cannot watch? As reasonable, mentally stable adults, some of us find that a little bit patronising. The second challenge in regulating the media today is in promoting cultural identity through content quotas. Now, in another video in this series, we have discussed about the content quotas that are placed on commercial TV networks by the Australian government. The purpose of these is to support the local media industry by producing a certain amount of new Australian content every year. This includes producing 55% local content between 6 a.m. and midnight on the main TV channels 7, 9 and 10, 260 hours of Australian children's programming, including 50% first-run programs. Similarly, Foxtel are required to spend 10% of its drama budget on locally produced Australian dramas. However, the same rules don't apply to streaming video on demand or SVOD services like Netflix and Stan. They are not currently subjected to content quotas. And while Stan produces some original local content, like the cop comedy No Activity, Netflix has produced just one Australian Netflix original in its history, a drama called Tidelands. This single Aussie original, despite Netflix's estimated budget of $8 billion and producing over 700 original productions by the year 2018. Now, this imbalance has led to some debate about whether ACMA should enforce similar content quotas on SVOD services. Before we get into that debate, here are some statistics about Netflix in Australia. In May 2020, it was estimated that almost 12 million Aussies have access to Netflix. And yet, in a study conducted by RMIT University in October of 2019, they found that Australian content only amounts for 1.7% of the overall Netflix Australia catalogue. So you've got over a third of Australians watching Netflix, and yet less than 2% of the content on there being Australian. As I mentioned, there has been only one Australian Netflix original called Tidelands, and this was only a single season. So, the content quota debate. In September 2017, various industry associations combined to launch a campaign called Make It Australian. This was a lobby to push the Australian government to require Netflix to spend 10% of its Australian earnings on Aussie programming. The Make It Australian campaign said that federal politicians are the custodians of Australian screen stories. They must act now to ensure that existing Aussie content rules are first preserved and then extended to cover SVOD services. And as you can imagine, the streamers themselves have argued against this restriction being placed on them. They insist that content quotas cause more harm than they do good, such as leading to low quality programming. Netflix CEO Reed Hastings said that quotas are well intentioned, but like most things, they often backfire. And the CEO of Stan has said that quotas would only serve to stifle innovation and creativity. What their evidence is for these claims, we're not actually too sure. But the Australian government appear to be moving towards enforcing quotas on the streaming services. In July 2019, the ACCC released a report which recommended that digital media platforms such as Netflix, YouTube and Facebook be brought under the same rules and regulations as traditional broadcast media in Australia. If the proposed measures were enforced, SVOD giants like Netflix would have to produce and distribute more Australian originals, thereby contributing to the local media industry as well as paying more tax. Paul Fletcher, the Australian Communications Minister, said that today the free-to-air networks have an obligation to show a certain amount of Australian content. But streaming platforms like Netflix or YouTube don't have such obligations, even though they're capturing a huge number of eyeballs in the Australian market and, in the case of Netflix, substantial revenue. And these things shouldn't be a big deal to Netflix. They already do it in Europe. The European Union, or the EU, is well ahead of Australia in regards to this. In April 2018, the EU Parliament voted to impose a 30% local content quota on Netflix, Amazon Prime, and any other streaming service. Remember, in Australia, we've only asked for a 10% local content quota. So you would think that with all this talk and with other nations actually enforcing these rules, that 4 years down the track, this would have actually progressed, and yet not a single law about this has passed. Furthermore, in response to the coronavirus pandemic, the government have actually temporarily suspended the Australian drama and children's TV quotas for commercial networks. This has resulted in less Aussie content being produced and a massive blow to the Australian media industry, where job losses continue to increase due to the pandemic. And yet, as more people are stuck isolated indoors, Netflix subscriptions have increased, making the platform more popular and profitable than ever. Australian TV jobs have been slashed from the ABC and Channel 10, with more expected to come from the other networks. Certainly, forcing Netflix to produce local content would reinvigorate the industry. So to evaluate this debate about whether Netflix should have quotas enforced on them to produce local content, let's look at the advantages and disadvantages. Some of the pros are that it would support the local media industry, guaranteeing jobs, which is more important now than ever. It would aim to promote and maintain Australian stories and promote the representation of national cultural identity. Also, the advantage of local content is that children's programming would ensure that Australian kids are not Americanized from consuming mainly Hollywood content. However, some of the limitations of this are that it can result in low quality content, with streaming services like Netflix just trying to tick a box in the cheapest way possible. It's not like we would get the Australian Game of Thrones. We're more likely to get game shows or cheaply made house hunting programs. Also, this may not actually result in Australian stories, just Australian productions. Keep in mind that Netflix is a global streaming service. They want stories that appeal to the majority, not just the niche Australian market. So just because it's produced here doesn't necessarily make it an Australian story. Finally, it is unclear as to how content quotas would work on social media platforms such as TikTok and YouTube. How exactly do you ensure that Australian audiences are engaging with Australian content? How do you ensure that Australian content creators are being promoted and paid? So to recap these challenges in regulation. As the contemporary media landscape continues to evolve, regulators cannot rely on the practices that once worked in the broadcast era. The reasons for regulating the media are as important as ever. But as audience agency increases and we're becoming more demanding in consuming what we want when we want, the Australian government needs to act faster than they have been in order to promote Australian stories and media industry jobs and uphold the standards of Australian citizens. At the moment, the media is evolving far too fast for regulators to catch up.